Jonathan is a member of the Wurundjuri and Kamilaroi nations of Southeast Australia. He's an artist, curator and researcher. As an artist, he works across a range of mediums, from printmaking and drawing to sculpture and film, to create site-specific installations and interventions that engage with Aboriginal practices, relationships and knowledge. His work champions local knowledge systems, is grounded in research of the historical archive and builds on community aspirations. So join me in welcoming Jonathan. Thank you.
Yorodo marang o maranaran mujigalang. Good morning, everyone. Baladu Radri bu Kamilaroi bu Gibibu. I'm Radri in Kamilaroi. Ngati Ninja Mara Mayangalangu Nurambangu. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this country, and in particular Uncle Ray for his welcome this morning. As mentioned, the object I chose to look at was a very particular shield, a parrying shield by William Barak, who was a Wurundjuri Narangita or elder from down near Melbourne. And this is an image of the shield here. And just for anyone who's maybe not familiar with these shields, this is both sides of the shields. I've just created a mirror image. They're sort of triangular in cross-section. So this is the two faces, if you like, to help you kind of understand the shield. I'm really grateful for being invited, but I'm even more grateful for being second and being after Stephen's talk, because he helped provide some track work for a lot of the ideas that I'll be covering in relation to museums and how objects are displayed. And providing that context is really important because it helps frame this work. And so I'll just sort of quickly go over some of those ideas, because I think it's important to understand how objects, cultural objects have been collected, how they've been contextualised and how they've been cared for, because it sort of leads us to why this object is obviously so important. I just grabbed this image. I've always been really interested in this image in a sort of more of a visual way, but obviously museum contexts and the way Aboriginality has been constructed within ethnography and collecting practices has been highly problematic for a whole number of reasons. And as Stephen talked about this morning, but I think this image from Pitt Rivers Museums really helps describe to you some of those ideas of evolution and object evolution, and how notions of evolution were then applied to our cultural heritage. And that idea of collecting these objects, particularly in context in the southeast of Australia, where so much cultural and sort of devastation occurred. And so that idea of collecting these objects, and when we read those words from those collectors, they're very heavily mindful of this salvage ethnography, this idea of coming in and trying to collect the last of everything, to try and salvage these ideas together to represent humanity in some way, while on the other hand willfully causing the destruction of those communities and being engaged in a whole bunch of activities that would see those communities not be in existence anymore. This idea of how Aboriginal materials are then displayed and almost appear like trophies, the way that they're constructed, placed. You can see here this construction of what's deemed Aboriginal weapons, which is again a term I find problematic. How these objects are termed as weapons. Within Aboriginal societies, they're objects that have a number of different purposes, and the idea of highlighting the weaponry is obviously supporting the notion of a savage, and this idea of promoting a warlike nation that Australia was meant to be. Obviously, other collections that probably I've been lucky enough to work on and sort of look in more detailed. You can see here this idea of that constant amassing of materials. And as Stephen talked about this morning, that idea of not needing people's names. These are just objects representing a culture, representing a dying culture. And for the most part, when we look at the bulk of the material, it's often men's material, no children's material, and very little women's material. So effectively, if the sort of ethnographic practices, were to be taken as gospel, we would be, people would be fair enough in sort of surmising that Aboriginal culture, there was probably only men in Aboriginal culture, and we must have appropriated with ourselves. And when we weren't doing that, we were beating each other up with a lot of weapons, which, as we know, is a highly problematic kind of construction of a cultural identity to take. Obviously, this image here is from the Garden Palace, and I'm also very critical of the care of Aboriginal heritage in cultural institutions, and I think a lot more work needs to be done. And obviously, the Garden Palace is, a perfect example of how that care has taken place, and what happens when these objects get amassed, and the kind of responsibility around them is sort of problematic. And of course, it was really interesting when we saw the museum in Brazil burning down. I can't tell you how many emails and stories people sent to me about that museum. And so this image, even though this image from Sydney is from the 1880s, it's an image that is happening today, right now. How we look after our cultural heritage. But in short, shields from the southeast are perhaps one of the most important and one of the most interesting objects within our cultural sort of remit. We produced, generally sort of two types of shields: these broad shields, which you can see in the front, and the more parrying shields, the little narrow ones in the back. They're highly decorated objects. They're objects that have been carved with lineal designs, and these lineal designs, which are made up of, squares, diamonds, chevrons. These are designs which we see time and time again sort of used within the southeast. We see it from everything from ground paintings to possum skin cloaks to carved trees. This visual language and use of line is something very, very important to the southeast, and they're kind of best kind of celebrated on shields. Now, my research has been slowly looking through shields. Because of the way Australia was obviously colonised and being a colony, a lot of our materials exists in overseas collections, and as you can see here, this is actually the British Museum collection that I was lucky enough to research. And for instance, in New South Wales, with the destruction of the Garden Palace, we lost a lot of our material that was meant to be at the Australian Museum. The museum in Victoria holds one of the biggest sort of collections in Australia of southeast material. And my process of research has sort of stumbled along in a way that I, for many years, haven't quite been sure of what I've been engaging with and what I've been doing. But what emerged very early on for me was the process of drawing the shields and trying to document them. Mainly because, and I think you can sort of see here even in this image, that the photographs themselves are often failures. That level of detail of the lines and how they're constructed often isn't captured in the sort of photographs. And, without sort of saying too much, I mean, I guess I've been working on this for, for a number of years now, and so a lot of the photographs you when you're requesting stuff from overseas museums, there's often no photographs, or the photographs that you get are really terrible. So this process of going in and sitting down and drawing shields has become a sort of key staple within my practice and the way that I research. And this research process is really embedded and has sort of, as I said, when I first started, it wasn't a formulated practice or process, if you like. But as I've continued to work, this has sort of grown into a methodology, and I've been lucky enough to work with one of my elders, Uncle Stan Grant, looking at thinking about these methodologies. One of the key ideas that we have within Wurundjeri society is this idea of yinjamara. It was one of the words I used when acknowledging country. Yinjamara is a word or yinjamali is a word about respect and honouring something. And so when you're really young, it's one of the first words you hear as a Wurundjeri person, yinjamara. You've got to show yinjamara. And this idea that when you then start drilling down on what it actually means, it's not really a word about respect. It is a word that we translate often into respect. It literally means to go slow. It means to slow down and act with thoughtfulness, act with knowledge, act with an awareness of who's around you, what's around you, and being respectful to everything that's in the world. So this process of sitting down and drawing these shields is this process of yinjamara, this idea of sitting down with them and often spending hours and hours in really cold basements, in really unfriendly environments with shields that haven't seen the light of day since they were collected, and spending time with them and just slowly drawing them. Parrying shields are relatively, I'm not going to say easy, but they're, because of the aperture, where the design sits, they're quite easy to capture. But when you start working on broad shields, some of those broad shields can take up to 4 to 5 hours, just sitting there trying to capture that detail and see what the artist was trying to do. And it's slowly been through this process of drawing these shields, which has become really important as a way of unpacking these objects and understanding them in a new way. I need to hurry up. The designs that we have on those shields are very, they're not well known. Although every anthropologist and commentator and person who came into contact with our shields and our objects often talk about them as being highly designed, really intricate works, they all espouse these great remarks on how beautiful they are. But of course, no one bothered to ask anyone what they actually meant. That would be too much hard work. The only little moments, fragments of information we have are from Bruce Smythe. You can see here this one quote from him commenting on this extraordinary shield from the Namoy River, so Gamilaroi country, that looks at this goanna, this guga, and the designs, and he talks about it as obviously having a relationship to people's totems. And of course, this correlates very directly with contemporary experiences today, with Rodney Carter here talking about that idea that what these shields and these designs represent. I'm really sorry about this image, but in fact this is a small club. This is the second example that we have again from Smythe that's talking about this small club. It's very difficult to see. This is probably a very good example of the types of images you get when you request images of wooden objects. And I'm sure I'm just seeing some people nodding here. I'm sure we've all experienced this when we receive these, it's terrifying. Because you're so keen to get into them and you get these tiny little thumbnails with something like this. But in fact, there's some beautiful line designs on the head of that club. And they're the designs that Smythe is talking about here, that they're actually talking about someone's country, they're representing a place. Another really important example, and this is probably the third sort of key example, is this this object here, which is again in the Melbourne Museum. It's a board that was created when someone passed away, and it was created by Simon Wonga, who was William Barak's cousin. And we can see here that not only is he depicting and working with those engraved lines, but he's actually there's a narrative here, an important story that's being told through these designs. And interestingly enough, this is one of the tools that people would use, a very small chisel that was made from the bottom tooth of a possum, mounted onto a handle and slowly gouging into the timber. So Simon Wonga's a really great place to jump back to William Barak. So as I said to you, they're literally kind of the handful of examples that give us a small insight from a Western perspective of what those shields represent, what those designs represent. As Stephen was talking about this morning, those objects from the 1800s, particularly from the southeast, 99% of those objects are by unknown artists. We don't know who they're made by. We often don't know where they come from. Sometimes it's just New South Wales. Sometimes, at the moment, I'm scrolling through lists from the Chicago Field Museum of objects that are just listed as general Australian objects and finding southeast material through that. They've not been catalogued very well, and so they're very difficult to sort of then reactivate when you need to go back in and sort of work with them. So this collection here of this shield and club from William Barak are extraordinarily rare. They're very handful example of objects that are known by a known maker. And as I said, this is extraordinarily rare. We know this because it's written on the object, that it was documented that this shield and this club was by William, and it was only acquired in the 1990s by the Koori Heritage Trust. They managed to find it at a small antique shop in Melbourne, and acquired them and put them into the collection. Really quickly, William Barak was obviously a very senior and important artist in Australia's history. He was born in 1824. Prior to invasion, he was present at the Batman Treaty, the signing of the alleged treaty with Batman in 1835, his father, Bebejan, was one of the Ngarrindjitas for their clan, and that clan leadership went to his cousin, Simon Wonga, and Simon Wonga, along with the support of William Barak, obviously supported and created Corranderk Aboriginal Station, which is a small Aboriginal station which was established in the Yarra Valley, just outside of Melbourne. The community was, and this is obviously really difficult, and I always sort of try to sort of preempt these sort of statements, but prior to colonisation, and estimations are terrible, population estimations are really fraught and problematic, but, conservative numbers of population of what we call Victoria today is something like, 20,000 people. After 35 years of invasion, it was down to 2,000 people. So we're talking about some severe issues with colonisation, murder of the culture, and how people were trying to move forward. So Simon Wonga and the community led a small group of about 40 people, to establish this small settlement at Corranderk. Simon Wonga passed away and William Barak became the Ngarrindjita. This small little community obviously experienced extraordinary hardship, although they were an enormously prosperative group, the way they worked, the way they collected and worked collaboratively, eventually saw the government put in the Aboriginal Protection Act, which meant that all Aboriginal people under 35 had to leave the mission, which effectively stripped the mission from any manpower, if you like. They weren't able to continue their crops, they weren't able to continue their harvesting or any of the work on the property, only leaving old people, and then the government slowly sequestered that land back. In his later years, in the last sort of 20 years of his life, Barak started doing these extraordinary works and engaging with education. And there's countless images of him trying to engage in education, trying to talk to people. really speeding up. So this is the work from the Koori Heritage Trust, and this is a digitised drawing, a digitisation of the drawing that I worked on to help explain to you the actual image of what we're looking at. When I started drawing this image, and when you start drawing the shields, you start to unpack how the artist has thought and how the artist is engaged in the mark-making process, which is really fantastic. You can probably go across every southeast community and every one of them will claim diamonds as theirs and that they're the masters in it. But as we probably all know and hopefully should know, there's a million different ways to make diamonds. And really interestingly with Barak's work, he creates diamonds through long lines. He literally draws the main frame of the diamond shapes in. Doing these very long designs, almost like a distorted chessboard, and then within that he then starts infilling the concentric diamonds. This is quite different to other artists who would build diamonds one off another, and you sort of get a more like a net shape. They're very sort of rigid. You'll also notice within his work is this extraordinary sort of river band through the centre, through where the handle is. Which is really important. There's also a number of other little features which sort of go into more detail. But after a while, I ended up a major collection of shields was acquired by the National Gallery of Australia. I'm trying to remember the year, not that long ago. And while drawing those shields and documenting those shields, I found this one. And so immediately I was struck by the similarity between this shield from the NGA and the one shield we know by William Barak. And again, we started to be able to verify some of those very similar techniques that were made, obviously the shape and the proportions of the shield, but really that idea of the way that those diamonds had been created through those long lines and then infilling, and then that wavy line in the centre. The process of us then working to get this shield, verified by the community and feeling that they were comfortable calling this William Barak shield was a very long process, as it should be. The process really was working with a number of people, and I really need to acknowledge Carol Cooper, who's a colleague of mine who has worked tirelessly in Southeast collections. Working with Carol, looking at these shield comparisons. But of course, the most important port of call was talking to community. And so I've been very lucky to work with Annie Joy Wandon Murphy for a number of years. Annie Joy is one of the senior Wurundjuri elders. She's the great-grandniece of William Barak and has been very engaged in cultural practices, like cultural events and processes on her country. Annie Joy was instrumental in coming to Canberra, looking at the shields. And even then, Annie Joy was like, we really need to see them together. And I was like, God, how are we ever going to get two shields? One shield from the Koori Heritage Trust and one from the National Gallery together. But I was lucky enough to work on a show at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, which was managed to bring those two shields together, which was a really important moment. And at that moment, Annie Joy and other Wurundjeri community sort of were able to look at these shields and verify for themselves the mark of the artist's hand. And so overnight we were able to, well not overnight, but relatively, we were able to then go from this extraordinary man who led enormous change in Australia to go from knowing that we had one shield of his to now we have two, to recognise him as an artist, to give a name to that shield, to retrieve that object out of the archive and to place it within a cultural context was vitally important. And the key process for that, of course, was this idea of yinjamara, of sitting down with something and showing respect to it and letting that object sort of tell its story. And I really encourage people to engage with that notion of respect, that slow, deep, moving with an object, spending time with it, listening to it, and engaging with it to that moment where it begins to tell you stuff and begins to unpack some of its story for you to reveal. So thanks.